Welcome back to Conflicts of Interest. This is episode 402. I'm the host, Kyle Anzalone. I got a lot of news to talk about in today's show. Tit-top bans, Somalia war powers acts, and of course a lot of news on the war in Ukraine, so please share the show. It's hosted at the Libertarian Institute. We repost the show on the blog at antiwar.com. You can follow me on Twitter at KyleAnzalone_, and you can find the show just about anywhere people publish things, YouTube, Rumble, and Odysee for the video version, and it's up anywhere you can listen to audio podcasts. Let's get into the news. All right, first up today, we have some more good legislation coming from Representative Matt Gaetz. He has introduced a bill to withdraw the U.S. from Somalia. And on Tuesday, this is from Dave DeCamp at antiwar.com, Representative Matt Gaetz introduced a war powers resolution that would direct the president to remove all armed forces from Somalia, and is co-sponsored by Revs Paul Gosar and Ana Paulina Luna. And Gosar has actually written an article for antiwar.com endorsing Defend the Garden. That's actually making a lot of progress in his state of Arizona. So, there are some bad things that, these Republicans do and say, but on the war issue, they have been getting better and better. And so this is definitely something that we need to encourage. I am not convinced that this war powers resolution is going to pass. However, we have seen in the past that merely bringing war powers resolutions to the floor of Congress forces or can put pressure on the White House to alter its war position. And we see them tailor back their support for Saudi Arabia and Yemen and curtail the violence going on in that country. Even if it's not by much, those steps do happen. And so it's not a bad thing, that these bills are coming up, that they're gaining attention, that they're getting co-sponsors. So this is, I think, some potentially good news. So let's get into the rest of it here. All right, back to the article. The resolution would mandate the removal of all U.S. armed forces in Somalia, with the exception of embassy security, within 365 days of the bill being adopted. The resolution is privileged, meaning the House will have to vote on the measure within 18 legislative days. The introduction comes after Gaetz grilled General Michael Langley, the head of U.S. AFRICOM, about the pattern of U.S. military training African coup leaders. The American people have extremely low confidence in our military leaders and their ability to assess their own efficiency. How do they expect the Americans to believe their justification for occupying Somalia when they can't even determine who in their own training programs will lead a violent coup afterwards, Gaetz said in a statement. Earlier this month, the House voted down a war powers resolution for Syria that was introduced by Gaetz. When the House debated my resolution to withdraw from Syria, both Republicans and Democrats argued that the 2001 authorization for use of military force against Afghanistan serves a global permission slip for every neocon fantasy. They will argue the same for Somalia, Gaetz said. The 2001 AUMF, which was passed in the wake of the September 11 attack for the invasion of Afghanistan, is used to justify the U.S. war against al-Shabaab, a group that didn't even exist when the authorization first became law. Senator Rand Paul introduced an amendment in the Senate to repeal the 2001 AUMF last week, but failed by a vote of 9 to 86. It does seem to me there's a little bit more interest in a non-interventionist or less interventionist foreign policy in the House and the Senate. So this Gaetz resolution may do a little bit better in the House than it would in the Senate. The war against al-Shabaab in Somalia has escalated since President Biden ordered the deployment of 500 troops in the country in May 2022. The Biden administration recently vowed that it would increase support for the Mogadishu-based government. The U.S.-backed government launched a major offensive against al-Shabaab last year, leading to more U.S. airstrikes, although AFRICOM has not reported any strikes in the month of March. The last airstrike in Somalia that AFRICOM reported took place on February 21st. However, AFRICOM doesn't announce all of its airstrikes, so there could have been some in the past month. The U.S. military portrays al-Shabaab as a major threat due to its size and affiliation with al-Qaeda, but it's widely believed the group doesn't have ambitions outside of Somalia, certainly not outside the Horn of Africa. They've carried out attacks in, I think, Ethiopia and Kenya, but that's it. Al-Shabaab was born out of a U.S.-backed Ethiopia invasion of Somalia that was launched in 2006, and that group didn't declare loyalty to al-Qaeda until 2012, after years of fighting the U.S. and its proxies. All right, we got a little bit more action going on in the Congress that I think is worth talking about. Bill to ban TikTok would give government sweeping powers to crack down on tech. A bill introduced in the Senate designed to ban video sharing app TikTok would give the Biden administration sweeping authorities to crack down on transactions between people in the U.S. and countries deemed foreign adversaries related to information and communication technology. The Restricting the Emergence of Security Threats and Risk Information Communications Technology, RESTRICT Act, is the acronym they're using, would authorize the Commerce Secretary to review and prohibit certain transactions between persons in the United States and foreign adversaries for other purposes. TikTok is not mentioned by name in the bill, but its introduction comes as Congress is looking to ban the app, which is owned by the Chinese company ByteDance. The allegation is that TikTok is Chinese owned. It's obliged to share user data with the Chinese government and can be used as a spying tool, similar to how the FBI and NSA have backdoor access from Facebook, Google, Apple, Microsoft, and other U.S. tech platforms. The CEO of TikTok, Xu Zichu, denied the allegations when he was grilled by Congress last week and said China has not asked the company to share American data, but there is still a strong bipartisan support for banning TikTok and the Restrict Act, which was led by Senator Mark Warner and has 21 co-sponsors, 11 Republicans and 10 Democrats. And if anybody watched the video from that committee hearing, they will know that the members of Congress do not understand this issue very well at all. They little understanding of technology, how these apps work, how algorithms work, who has what access, to access to what kind of data. So this is pretty concerning that people with so little knowledge have so much power on so many issues. And look, this isn't limited to just the technology side of it, although, you would assume with like an average age of 70 something that exists in the Congress that, these people likely aren't even running their own Twitter accounts. So they don't have a lot of idea of how all this works. They're not involved with it very much. So this is, very concerning but it goes and happens with like all the foreign policy issues as well, where the people making the policy understand absolutely nothing about it. The White House has also expressed support for the bill. In a statement on March 7th, the day the legislation was introduced, National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan said the White House applauds the effort. We look forward to continue working with both Democrats and Republicans on this bill and urge Congress to act quickly and send it to the president's desk. The Restrict Act will authorize Commerce Secretary Gina Raimondo to take action against any transaction between a U.S. person and a foreign adversary that she deems poses a risk to U.S. national security. The bill names 6 foreign adversaries: China, Russia, North Korea, Venezuela, Iran, and Cuba. I have to say, from what I do, what Dave DeCamp does at antiwar.com, this bill seems very concerning, and would merely communicating with somebody in Russia, in Venezuela, in Iran, in Cuba, and China be enough to have us punished with this act, which apparently a person who violates this act could be fined up to $1 million or punished with 20 years in jail. Now, another thing to point out here, Gina Raimondo, I believe she was formerly the governor of Rhode Island, and when the lockdown started, Rhode Island was one of the strictest states as far as allowing people just to travel through. So this woman is a full-on authoritarian. I think they were actually, stopping people just for having out-of-state license plates in the countries, in their state. So again, very, very concerning here. Now, a couple other stories that are, going to really have a lot of impact, be very important, even though it's not, the biggest news topic. But I think this is going to be huge when you look at what the relationship between Europe and Russia is going to look like going forward. All right, so I wrote this article for the Libertarian Institute on March 27th. EU planning to invest frozen Russian assets, give returns to Ukraine. The European Union is developing a proposal on what to do with assets seized from Russia by the Russian central bank by member states. According to European officials, the bloc may invest the money and hand the returns to Ukraine. A Swedish diplomat who leads the commission exploring what to do with the Kremlin's money told Politico that whatever decision is made, it will be without precedent. There is a consensus among EU member states that it is important to examine very, very carefully what is to be done under the instructions, and what we've been given, including what is to be done, will have to be in compliance with EU and international law, she said. We are in an exceptional situation, and probably any solution we come up with here will be a nature that hasn't been done before. And look, the Russian invasion of Ukraine, bad, condemn Putin for it, everything like that. But to say it's unprecedented is just absurd. The U.S. invaded Iraq 20 years ago, and none of these steps are taken against the U.S. by any European countries. Imagine Europe taking American money, investing it, and then giving the proceeds to the Iraqi government. Something like that would never happen. So, this is clearly just to punish Russia. The diplomats believe the bloc will be able to legally invest the funds because Russia's invasion of Ukraine is an exceptional and gross violation of international and humanitarian law. However, the commission admits it will have to change sanction regulations to carry out the plan. The current statutes say once funds are unfrozen, the target government gets access to their capital, as well as any returns that accrued during the sanctioned period. The bloc hopes other Western nations will join the scheme. The EU is taking steps in coordination with the Group of Seven, G7. So that's the US, Australia, Japan, Canada, I believe, too. The European Union, all in that group. The commission estimates that the EU and G7 countries have about 300 billion in Russian central bank assets that they have frozen, and they believe if invested, it can earn a 2.6% return. However, anytime you are investing money, you are putting that money at risk. And so the EU is not sure how it would handle losses. Losses can never be excluded. And so the question is, who bears any residual risk in the case of such losses will require a clear legal answer, the commission admitted. Any losses will have political and financial implications. The commission was created last month at the direction of Sweden. The mandate is to contribute to mapping which funds have been frozen in the European Union, and secondly, how to legally proceed to access those funds, the Swedish Prime Minister said when it created the group. The Swedish Prime Minister stated that the Russian citizens must bear the cost of the war in Ukraine, and continued to say that Russian taxpayers, not all other taxpayers, who must bear the necessary reconstruction work. And again, this just isn't how things are done on the international stage. Americans aren't responsible as taxpayers for the damage done to Iraq or Afghanistan or Syria or Yemen, all these countries where, we've been bombing and supporting the invasion of these countries for years and years and years. So this is a unique step done just to punish Russia. And I think one of the things it will do is ensure that even if somehow the war in Ukraine is brought to a permanent end. So say Russia captures the territory they want, they sign some kind of deal with the Kiev rump state that's left, and withdraw their, forces, or at least, don't engage in any new battles or something like that, then this will be a lingering issue that prevents, I think, Russia from really mending ties with the West. And so this is a real problem, and it's going to be going forward. More bad news. You have to withhold nuclear weapons data from Russia. I wrote this yesterday for the Libertarian Institute. The White House announced on Tuesday that it will no longer send the Kremlin data on its nuclear weapons. Under the New START treaty, the U.S. and Russia agreed to share such information. However, Moscow suspended its involvement in the pact, and amid rapidly deteriorating relations with Washington. National Security Council spokesperson John Kirby told reporters that the White House made the decision after concluding Russia is in violation of the landmark arms control treaty, hoping the move will push Moscow to resume full compliance. This is the statement from Kirby. As a lawful countermeasure intended to encourage Russia to return to compliance with the treaty, the U.S. will likewise not provide its biannual data update to Russia. The United States informed Russia in advance of this step. In the interest of strategic stability, the United States will continue to promote public transparency on our nuclear forces level and posture. He that Moscow was no longer sharing nuclear data with the United States. However, Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov appeared to contradict Kirby, saying there had been no contact between the two sides regarding New START. Russian officials suspended its participation in the New START treaty on March 1st, but the Kremlin said it would continue to comply with the nuclear weapons cap set under the agreement. Moscow's top diplomat said our readiness to adhere to the caps on the strategic nuclear arms in the treaty is nothing more than a goodwill gesture. So this is, really problematic that Russia has suspended this treaty. Of course, I don't want to sound biased. The U.S. has been very responsible for the deterioration of the strategic agreements with Russia, the anti-ballistic missile treaty, the intermediate range nuclear forces treaty, and then the Open Skies Treaty are all agreements that the U.S. abandoned over the past couple of decades that were key in securing the strategic relationship with Russia, as well as agreements that the U.S. made over the 1990s period with Russia. So not to expand NATO, not to deploy any troops into former Warsaw Pact or USSR states. All those violations have happened, and so that has to be taken into account when looking at why Russia took the step that they did here. The Kremlin argued that U.S. travel restrictions on Russian officials inspecting the American stockpile, and so parts of the New START treaty were a cap on the number of nuclear weapons that each country may deploy at any given time, requirements for periodic inspections, and the transfer of nuclear data. And so Russia said that the U.S. actions prevented the inspections, and that's why they ultimately took this step to suspend the treaty. Now, one, little piece of not terrible news here is the White House press secretary stated that the U.S. has not seen any indications Russia is preparing to use a nuclear weapon. And so, the fact that they're at least playing down this issue at the White House, I think is a good sign at this point. It does seem that both countries are still tiptoeing around and complying with, the New START treaty, at least in spirit. The main things, the caps on nuclear weapons and stuff like that. If that starts to break down, then, there could be a real problem. All right, now let's move on. Talk about Hungary ratifying Finland's NATO membership, and this is something that we have predicted in the past on the show. I've been saying for months that the reason Hungary hadn't taken the step to ratify Finland and Sweden's NATO membership is they're basically waiting on Turkey to ask. Hungary has one of the stronger relationships in NATO with Russia, and I think they didn't want to deteriorate that relationship unnecessarily. However, they are a member of NATO, and so if they would not approve the membership of Finland or Sweden, which would block it, right? Every single country has to. So if Hungary says no, then Finland doesn't become a NATO member. But at the same time, I don't think that Hungary wanted to be, that country, because it's probably going to get the leader targeted with a regime change, to just be frank about it. Would be my guess. And so with Turkey taking this step, Hungary doesn't want to be the last country. Turkey says they're going to approve membership for Finland by, I want to say, mid-May. And so I'm guessing that we're going to see Hungary make it official in the next week or so. All right. Next up here, tanks are getting to Ukraine. The first batch of British-made Challenger 2 tanks arrived in Ukraine on Monday. As a report said, Berlin also delivered 18 of its Leopard tanks to the country. The UK will send a total of 14 Challenger 2 tanks that will be armed with depleted uranium ammunition, a controversial munition that is linked to cancer and birth defects in Iraq, where U.S. forces commonly use the rounds. British Deputy Defense Minister confirmed last week that the Challenger 2s would be armed with depleted uranium despite Russian warnings Over the weekend, Russian President Vladimir Putin said Russia would deploy nuclear weapons to Belarus, a move he said was in response to the UK arming Ukraine with depleted uranium. Additionally, on Monday, reports said Germany had delivered 18 of its Leopard tanks to Ukraine. A German outlet pointed out the last of the tanks left Germany last week and were handed to Ukraine at the border. Poland said in February they had delivered 4 Leopard tanks to Ukraine and was preparing to send more. Germany initially planned to put together 60 Leopard tanks for Ukraine, but has fallen short of that goal. The U.S. plans to speed up its plan to send 31 Abrams tanks to Ukraine, but they're going to deliver oldish refurbished models rather than sending new ones to Ukraine, and that's the way they're going to get that done. It's still going to take 8 to 10 months, apparently. Russian officials say Moscow has weapons that can destroy the U.S., so, we have a nuclear threat here from Russia. This doesn't happen too often that, we have these threats being made even throughout this war. But every time we do, it's really important to take note of it and just to be concerned. This is from the Security Council Secretary of Russia. So concerning, very concerning. But at the same time, we have seen these before in the war. So just something to keep an eye on. Next up, Senate votes down amendment to create special watchdog for Ukraine. This is amazing to me, right? You have now over $100 billion that the U.S. has authorized to spend on the war in Ukraine. And to create an office to look over that is not that big of a deal, right? To monitor and make sure that money is going where it's supposed to go. I can't even understand why Congress can really oppose that. The only thing I could think of is that the members of the Senate know the reality that enough weapons aren't actually making it to the front line if the American people understand what this money is actually being spent on, or they have to admit that they can't track this money, then the American people are going to politically turn against giving Ukraine another blank check, massive aid package, and that's why we're seeing these steps being taken. But it's amazing. The vote was 26 to 68, 24 Republicans for it, only 2 Democrats for it. Again, oversight, $100 billion of our tax dollars being spent militarily. They just don't care about looking at. All right, now let's get into Zelensky's religious war. Ukrainian police in Kiev are preparing to evict Orthodox priests who are refusing to leave the historic monastery I believe this is in Kiev. It is the Monastery of the Caves, I guess is the way you say it in English. The effort is a part of a broad crackdown on the Ukrainian Orthodox Church launched by the government of Ukrainian President Zelensky. The Ukrainian Orthodox Church, UOC, has historic links to Russia, but is the largest church in Ukraine, having more parishes than the similarly named Orthodox Church of Ukraine, which has no affiliation with Moscow. In the wake of the Russian invasion of Ukraine, the UOC denounced the war and cut ties with Moscow, but the steps were not enough for Zelensky. Some UOC priests have been accused of collaborating with Russian troops, and now many are facing sanctions, criminal charges, and evictions. The 500 UOC priests, nuns, and theologians living at the Monastery of the Caves have been given until Wednesday to leave the monastery, but say they aren't going anywhere. I won't leave unless I am forced to, a young monk told the Times of London. And so, this is a very important part of what's happening in Ukraine, and to understand why Russia intervened and why the people of the Donbass, the people of Crimea wanted to leave, and didn't want to be ruled by Kiev anymore. And that's because there's a very real culture war against the ethnic Russian population in Ukraine. And this is a very important and large piece of it, is targeting this church. No surprise here, but still disappointing news. UN Security Council won't probe Nord Stream bombings. The UN Security Council voted on Monday against a Russian effort to get independent investigation into the bombing of the Nord Stream natural gas pipelines that connect Russia to Germany. The only members of the council voted in favor of the resolution were Russia, China, and Brazil. The remaining 12 members abstained from the vote, including the U.S., the likely culprit of the attacks. The resolution had little chance of passing since it needed at least 9 votes in favor and no veto from any of the 5 permanent members of the Security Council. That's the U.S., Russia, Britain, and France. Oh, China too. So if there were 9 other members that were going to vote for this, so Brazil and then the other non-permanent members were all going to go with this, my guess is that the U.S. or Britain would have gone ahead and vetoed this resolution. Russia has been pushing for an international inquiry into the Nord Stream sabotage since investigative journalist Seymour Hersh published a bombshell report in February that alleged Biden ordered the bombings. Hersh's report said U.S. Navy divers planted the explosives on the pipelines in June 2022 under the cover of NATO exercises in the Baltic Sea. The operation was carried out with Norway, and a Norwegian spy plane dropped the sonar buoy on September 26th that detonated the explosive. All right, we have some more diplomacy here going on in the Middle East. I think that was my last Ukraine war story here. This is more of a Russia story. But this time it is Russia that's doing the diplomacy and not China. The deputy foreign ministers of Syria, Turkey, Russia, and Iran will meet in Moscow in April as a part of an effort to normalize ties between Damascus and Ankara. An unnamed senior Turkish official told Reuters that the meeting will be held from April 3rd to 4th. This meeting is expected to be a continuation of the ministerial level meetings that have begun during the normalization process. The official added that significant decisions are not expected because the meeting is being held on the deputy level. The talks will build on a meeting between Syria and Turkey's defense ministers that was hosted by Russia in December 2022, marking the first time the two countries held talks at that level since 2011. A normalization deal between Syria and Turkey would be a huge breakthrough, as Ankara was still a major supporter of the failed regime change effort of Syrian President Bashar al-Assad. Turkey occupies area in northern Syria, and Assad has told Russia that any deal must involve a Turkish withdrawal. More and more regional countries are accepting that Assad isn't going anywhere and are upgrading their ties with Damascus. Reuters reported last week that Saudi Arabia and Syria have agreed to establish ties and reopen their embassies, steps that could happen after a Muslim holiday that will be celebrated on April 21st and 22nd. The U.S. opposed any countries upgrading ties with the Assad government and reaffirmed the position in response to the potential news of Syria and Saudi normalizations. A State Department spokesperson told antiwar.com in an email, "Our stance against normalization remains unchanged. We will not normalize with the Assad regime, nor will we encourage other absent, authentic, and enduring progress towards a political solution." You know, the Syrian people are really suffering. This war has been just dragging on, right? Like ISIS carries out attacks. There's some fighting in the Idlib province of Syria. Of course, there's a conflict between the U.S. and the Shia militias in the country. And all of this could start to be resolved if the U.S. gets out of the way. But the U.S. is staying in the way and just endlessly increasing the suffering of the Syrian people. And of course, while the U.S. says that, oh, it's all about, keeping our troops in the region, to make sure that ISIS doesn't come back, we know that the Iraqi government, that the Kurds, that the Syrian government, that the Shia militias, Russia and Iran, all want to eliminate the Islamic State very, very, very much. And so there's plenty of forces that will kill the ISIS members. What the U.S. is really doing in Syria is still just clinging on to the regime change. They really want to take out Assad, and they think that if they stay forever, continue punishing the Syrians, eventually the Syrian people will rise up and overthrow the government. All right, a couple more quick stories before we wrap up here. China willing to sign treaty to make Southeast Asia a nuclear weapons-free zone. The Chinese foreign minister has pledged that Beijing is willing to become the first nuclear-armed state to sign a treaty that made Southeast Asia a nuclear weapons-free zone. The 10 members of the Association of Southeast Asian Nations are signatories to the 1997 treaty that bans nukes in the region. Under the Treaty of Southeast Asian Nuclear Weapons-Free Zone, the ASEAN states pledged not to develop, manufacture, or otherwise acquire, possess, or have control over nuclear weapons, station, or transport nuclear weapons by any means or test or use nuclear weapons. The Chinese official made the pledge on Monday during a meeting with the Secretary General of the Southeast Asian Nations Group. China is willing to take the lead in signing a protocol to the Southeast Asia Nuclear Weapons Free Zone Treaty and advocate within the group for solidarity and win-win cooperations on safeguard and stability. This would be, I don't know, crazy, because I guess this would mean China giving up its nuclear weapons. That doesn't seem to be, you know, something China is willing to do, but maybe they really want to sign this agreement to keep the U.S. from positioning any nuclear weapons in the region, particularly in Australia. All right, Korea news here. U.S. aircraft carrier conducts drills with South Korean military. I just want to point this out because my guess is in the coming days we will see some pretty big or provocative statements by the North Koreans. I think recently they said they had a plan where they could put a nuclear weapon on a submarine that's a drone, so unmanned, and then use that to create a nuclear tidal wave. And then we're going to have the president of South Korea come and speak to the American Congress. I believe he, once referred to the American Congress as effers, so I wonder how this is going to go over. However, just, remembering, that I have a longer term memory than essentially everyone in Congress, so they've all moved on from it. And my guess is that they like the South Korean president, Yoon Suk-yeol, because he's far more hawkish than his predecessor, willing to let Americans station more weapons in the region. And while South Korea probably has an eye on North Korea, Washington has an eye on China, and putting weapons in South Korea for them, I think, is more about, again, direction towards China than North Korea. All right, everybody, that's going to wrap up the show today. Thank you so much for tuning in. I'll be back with one more show later in the week. Connor Freeman, the show's co-host, will return. And then, of course, a full week of shows next week. Thank you all so much for tuning in.